Well, during this period, the same guy who'd turned me on to Olson and the distance poem said there's another poet that I've been reading. And curiously enough, I'd found him myself. There was a wonderful bookshop in London at that time in Camden Town called Compendium. And what I was thinking of this bookshop and how these bookshops work, well, they were like ports. They were actually not unlike Gloucester might have been itself, in that the cargoes came in, the really valuable cargoes, came across the Atlantic into these bookshops. Sometimes illegitimately. They weren't allowed to import these American books, but they did. And they were importing books from Paris and Spain, South America, North America, USA. They were all there. And one shop at one time had become nothing but poetry. And while I was wandering through this shop, I saw a book which I liked the look of, but I thought it was a complete rip-off from Olson. And this was a book called The Kitchen Poems by Jeremy Prynne. And I didn't get it then until this guy came back and said, you know, you really got to read Jeremy Prynne. If you look at the cover, I don't know if you can see it, of the Kitchen Poems, it's a map of oil exploration off the east coast of Britain. And you look at the Maximus poems with the chart of the harbour here, they're very connected. And you see something like letter 16 in the Maximus poems, where he's talking about Bowditch, who ran Harvard, and he talks about, he represents then that movement of northeast moneys away from primary production and trade to the several cankers of profit-making which have, like the Agiasta, made America great. Meantime, of course, swallowing up the land and labour, and now swallowing up the world. Well, Jeremy Prynne, the English poet, was clearly influenced by Olson, who he knew, and in writing his poem Die a Millionaire, the tone is economic and it's Olsonian. The first essential is to take knowledge back to the springs, because despite everything, and especially the recent events carried under that flag, there is specific power in the idea of it, and he goes on. And the drift of that now is to divert the currency, as in England, to the northeast, as if it was actually losing its grip on the population. Real people slipping off the face of that lovely ground and leaving the green and pleasant lands of Northumberland to be nearer the belly and to catch the scraps. So I, luckily for me, read another book by Prynne that appeared just after this called The White Stones, and I was completely blown away. I thought, this is magnificent. And although clearly it had Olsonian elements to it, it was a thing of its own, and it was an extreme and brilliant intelligence, as I thought. And we, in the same way as walking to the door of that Panagrady's house and asking to see Ginsberg, took a train on a very cold winter's day to go up to Cambridge and to see this person, Jeremy Prynne. Well, now the idea was slightly different, and it was this. It was the idea that we should really have an English Black Mountain College, and he should be the rector of it. So two kind of straggly youths come to his door and say, we think, you know, we should get all the talents together and create an English Black Mountain College, and you should be rector. And he was wonderfully charming and didn't laugh us out of court, and we talked away for many, many hours. And you know, the stuff that was floated in that conversation kind of fed me for years. And when I went back to see him again, he talked about helping to arrange or edit one of the later gatherings of the Maximus poems. And while he was doing that, I saw on his desk another great pile of papers that seemed to be completely indecipherable, which he was also working to help arrange and organize. And they were Stephen Hawking's large-scale structure of space-time, which is impenetrable to most human beings, but which this character somehow was able to not only deal with, but help to form and do some of the language in it, as well as doing Olson. And I then discovered that at the moment that Olson had been performing in London, that I'd seen him, Prynne had actually been in Gloucester, and he was staying in Olson's apartment at 28 Fort Square, and was actually looking out at that Olsonian view. And he himself had a kind of moment of vision that was not unlike exactly what we had gone to propose to him. He said, while he was there, a community of English and American poets, despite the distance of the Atlantic, should be brought together, even if we have to build an ark. And what that period in the late 60s actually did was it was a building of an ark between these two cultures that was so strong. People like Ed Dorn came over and were in Essex University, and while he was staying in Colchester, Olson comes to see him, and they become very close to the English poet Tom Rayworth, who is one of the few who seems to have a kind of transatlantic reputation. And Rayworth, apart from being a very sharp poet, a bright kind of European poet who moves from a surrealism and a connection with the New York poets and artists, he is a publisher. He's a printer in the proper sense, and he ran a press called Goliard, and he prints Olson and gets to know Olson, has conversations with Olson. So Olson is a real presence in London, and comes across in a really curious episode where he goes down to Dorchester, Thomas Hardy territory, to research the founding of Gloucester, John White's papers and so on. And that for me is an extraordinary episode, and I believe his method of travel around England was always just to get in a taxi and say, take me to Gloucester, Edinburgh, wherever. You know, he'd never kind of figured out the systems of buses and trains. It's probably very wise. And so there he is, and he's very much part of the Prynnian effort that goes on in Cambridge, which becomes, as time goes on, very, very influential. There's a magazine called the English Intelligencer, run by another English poet as well called Andrew Crozier. And Crozier and John Temple both go to Buffalo and get to know Olson personally and are mentioned. Temple's mentioned in the Maximus poems. And Olson begins to cite Prynne in interviews as being so incredibly useful to him in terms of his research in Cambridge and in supplying him with materials, which I found in my own case he was brilliant at doing. And so there's a very real bond there. And this group begin to look from Cambridge and the London poets as well, influenced by Professor Eric Mottram, who had a group of people like Alan Fisher and Bill Griffiths around him, again citing Prynne and the idea that we should work with these bigger structures. We should look at open field poetics. And the classic book from that period would be an English writer called Alan Fisher, who wrote a book called Place, a sort of very open-ended, multi-parted piece, essentially beginning where he lived in Brixton in South London, involving walks, historic research, tracing lost rivers, scientific theory of the moment, economic theory, the whole political stuff, the whole package. And it again was obviously a totally Olsonian work. R.F. Langley, a different kind of poet, Roger Langley, had been a student with Prynne at Jesus College in Cambridge, and he was turned on to Olson and took him into the English village, which, using the kind of Olsonian thing, he talks about the parish, and he talks about trying to do poems based around the moment of enclosure. It's a political moment in England. What happens is the agricultural enclosures change the nature of a village, that instead of it having a common land in the middle, this is enclosed off and it falls into the hands of large landlords. And Langley wrote about that, and also wrote about using the warblers that he could see rather than kingfishers, but using gazing, standing under a tree. He said, what would happen if I stood stock still under a tree at the edge of the village for an hour and a half and I didn't move at all? And people began to think he was the tree. They just kind of passed by him, and he absorbed everything. And he created structures in a very English way that were totally Olsonian. Chris Torrance, a friend of mine who was a poet I published in my small press, moved at this time, under the influence of Olson, from Bristol, where he'd been a gardener. He moved into the Welsh countryside and lived in a remote cottage and started to do a project which he's still working on called The Magic Door, which involved deep examinations in Welsh mythology, long observations of the weather, all these kind of things, mixing the element of song and letter and dissertation and research all into a structure that goes back to this place. I was moving away from it. You know, I got on with my life. I was having to survive as a second-hand book dealer, and gradually I thought the real sense of loss was that Thatcherite period in 1979, which begins, this kind of big material push. The nature of London changes, and at the same time that kind of poetic vanishes from the landscape. It's not there. There's the small way that you could support groups of poets, maybe an audience of 20, 30, 40, maybe even this size, doing these events, bringing poets over from America. That kind of funding disappeared, and the regard that the poets were then held in began to disappear. And I think that's shocking, and I think it was painful, because this is an international. The thing here is that hits you when you're looking, say, at Fitzhenry Lane's painting. It's exactly what's in here. It's distances, and it's a thing that stands up. It's not a local. Although it's about a locality, it is a sense of looking at the world that has a very hierarchic and a dignified sense, a way that you understand what happens between land, sea, sky. Those essentials are there. And the sea is so preternaturally calm. Even when it's rough, it looks like a series of folded blankets. And we lost that, you know, we lost those sense of detail, the sense of attention. And I began to move away, first of all, into writing things that were Gothic, such as the novel that Greg mentioned, which was about this kind of the Thatcherite imperative as represented by street book dealers, slightly crazy, slightly hustling. Nothing has any value but what you can sell it for. A lot of kind of drug on the edge of that, a lot of craziness. And London being swallowed up overnight and losing its own memory, really in a bad way. That things were exactly where Olson at the end were writing these impassioned letters to the local paper here about buildings that are disappearing. Time and again, a major poet is engaging with a small building that's disappearing in his own town, his city, his golden city as he'd see it. And the same thing is happening all around me now, more and more and more. And I found that the figure that was most representative of this, to go back to see the process happening, was the poet John Clare, known as a peasant poet. And he'd lived in a small village north of Peterborough, and he had exactly this experience that I described with the Welsh Valley of the hills all round. Within this village of Helpston, everybody was eyes. Polis's eyes, the village's eyes also. Everybody knew him. And to be a poet was to be suspect, dubious, dangerous if you came out of the peasant class. And so he had to hide himself away to be a poet. He knew where the hollow trees were, and you went into them and you hid, and you could write on scraps of paper, which were very valuable. To have a piece of paper, he would have to use his mother's old shopping bills or something and write on them and hide the paper in his hat. So it was a phenomenal thing to do, and yet here was a person who knew in the same way the particulars of his own place. He knew what all the animals were. He knew almost every bird, you know, personally, every stone, every blade of grass. And then one day when he's in this field, he sees these two people arrive with sticks and chains, and he thinks it's some sort of terrible occult magical exercise. And of course what it is that people come out to survey the railways. And that moment of the railway arriving in this town is like the causeway 128 that Olson talks about coming into Gloucester. You've pushed this ladder across. You don't have the sanctity of being an island space. You're not the village there anymore. You are caught up in the general system of the world. And even at that moment, the tiny village becomes a sort of suburban extension of London. And this is enough to split Clare. His mind begins to split and be troubled. He talks about walking out of his knowledge. And he talks about open field, you know, in the same way. He survived because there was this open field, this area of discourse between the whole community of that village. They all came into this space. They shared it. And overnight it was gone. And he had to get permission to walk. To go through the fields was no longer his. The mind could not just run into its own patterns. And that thing of walking has been the whole methodology that I've always used for writing, and I think writing and walking, because it gives you that human speed, and it gives you the kind of Olsonian dance of your foot upon the ground. You move through.